6 weeks later. 1. The dark house. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. William Ernest Henley, Invictus. The sisters would like to see you in their chambers, Miss Gray. Tessa set the book she had been reading down on her bedside table, and turned to see Miranda standing in the doorway of her small room, just as she did at this time every day, delivering the same message she delivered every day. In a moment, Tessa would ask her to wait in the corridor, and Miranda would leave the room. 10 minutes later, she'd return and say the same thing again. If Tessa didn't come obediently after a few of these attempts, Miranda would seize her and drag her kicking and screaming down the stairs to the hot, stinking room where the dark sisters waited. It happened every day of the first week that Tessa had been in the dark house. As she had come to call this place, they kept her the prisoner, until eventually Tessa had realized that the screaming and kicking didn't do much good, and simply wasted her energy that was probably better saved for other things. "One moment, Miranda," Tessa said. The maid bobbed an awkward curtsy and went out of the room, shutting the door behind her. Tessa rose to her feet, glancing around the small room that had been her prison cell for 6 weeks. It was small, with flowered wallpaper, and sparsely furnished. A plain deal table with a white lace cloth over it where she ate her meals, the narrow brass bed where she slept, the cracked washstand and porcelain jugs for her ablutions, the windowsill where she stacked her books, and the small chair where she sat each night and wrote letters to her brother, letters she knew she could never send, letters she kept hidden under her mattress where the dark sisters would not find her. It was her way of keeping a diary and assuring herself somehow that she would see Nate again some day and be able to give them to him. She crossed the room to the mirror that hung across the far wall, and smoothed down her hair. The dark sisters, as they in fact seemed to wish to be called, preferred her not to look messy, although they didn't appear to mind her appearance one way or the other past that, which was fortunate, because her reflection made her wince. There was a pale oval in her face dominated by hollow grey eyes, the shadow face without colour in its cheeks, or hope in its expression. She wore the unflattering black school-marish dress that the sisters had given her once she'd arrived. Her trunk had never followed her, despite their promises, and this was now the only piece of clothing she owned. She looked away quickly. She hadn't always flinched from her reflection. Nate, with his fair good looks, was the one of the family generally agreed to have inherited her mother's beauty, but Tessa had always been perfectly content with her own smooth brown hair and steady grey eyes. Jane Eyre had brown hair, and plenty of other heroines besides. And it wasn't so bad being tall either, taller than most of the boys her age. It was true, but Aunt Harriet had always said that as long as a tall woman carried herself well, she would look forever regal. She didn't look regal now, though. She looked pinched and bedraggled, and altogether like a frightened scarecrow. She wondered if Nate would recognize her if he saw her today. At that thought her heart seemed to shrink inside her chest. Nate, he was the only one she was doing this for, but sometimes she missed him so much it felt like she'd swallowed broken glass. Without him, she was completely alone in the world. There was no one at all for her, no one in the world who cared whether she lived or died. Sometimes the horror of that thought, though, threatened to overwhelm her and plunge her down into a bottomless darkness from which there would be no return. If no one in the entire world cared about you, did you really exist at all? The click of the lock cut her thoughts off abruptly. The door opened. Miranda stood on the threshold. "It's time to come with me now, Miss Gray," she said. Miss Black and Miss Dark are waiting. Tessa looked at her in distaste. She couldn't guess how old Miranda was. 19? 25? There was something ageless about her smooth, round face. Her hair was the color of ditch water, pulled back harshly behind her ears. Exactly like the Dark Sister's coachman. She had eyes that protruded like a frog's, and made her look like she was permanently surprised. Tessa thought they must be related. As they went downstairs together, Miranda marching along with her graceless, clipped gait, Tessa raised her hand to touch the chain around her throat, where the Clockwork angel hung. It was habit, something she did each time she was forced to see the Dark Sisters. Somehow the feel of the pendant around her neck reassured her. She kept hold of it as they passed landing after landing. There were several levels of corridors of the dark house, though Tessa had seen nothing of it but the Dark Sisters' chambers, the halls and stairs, and her own room. Finally they reached the shadowed cellar. It was dank down there, the walls clammy with unpleasant moisture, though apparently the sisters didn't mind. Their office was ahead, through a set of double doors. A narrow corridor led the way into the other direction, vanishing into darkness. Tessa had no idea what lay down the hallway, but something about the thickness and the shadows made her glad she never found out. The doors to the sisters' office were open. Miranda didn't hesitate, but clumped inside, Tessa following after her with great reluctance. She hated this room more than any other place on earth. To begin with, it was always hot and wet inside, like a swamp. Even when the skies outside were grey and rainy, the walls seemed to seep moisture, and the upholstery on the seats and sofas were always blooming with mold. It smelled strange, like the banks of the Hudson on a hot day, water and garbage and silt. The sisters were already there, as they always were, seated behind their enormous raised desk. There were their unusual colorful selves. Miss Black in a dress of vibrant salmon pink, and Miss Dark in a gown of peacock blue. Above the brilliantly colored satin, their faces were like deflated gray balloons. They both wore gloves, despite how hot the room was. "Leave us now, Miranda," said Miss Black, who was spinning the heavy brass globe they kept on the desk with one plump, white-gloved finger. Tessa had so many times tried to get a better look at the globe. Something about the way the continents were laid out had never looked quite right to her, especially the space between Europe, but the sisters always kept her away from it. "And shut the door behind you." Expressionless, Miranda did as they asked. Tessa tried not to wince at the door as the door shut behind her, closing off what little breeze there was in this airless place. Miss Dark tilted her head to the side. "Come here, Teresa." Of the two women, she was the more kind, more likely to wheedle and persuade her than her sister, who liked to convince with slapped and hissed threats. "And take this." She held something out, a dilapidated bit of pink fabric tied into a bow, the sort that might be used as a girl's hair ribbon. She was used to being handed things by the Dark Sisters now, things that had once belonged to people, tie-pins and watches, mourning jewelry and children's toys, once the laces of a boot, once a single earring, stained with blood. "Take this," Miss Dark said again, a hint of impatience in her voice, "and change." Tessa took the bow. It lay in her hand, as light as a moth's wing, and the Dark Sisters stared impassively at her. She remembered books she had read, novels in which characters were on trial, standing quaking in the dock at the Old Bailey and praying for a verdict of not guilty. She often felt she was on trial herself in this room, without knowing of the crime she stood accused. She turned the bow over in her hand, remembering the first time the Dark Sisters had handed an object to her, a woman's glove with pearl buttons at the wrist. They had shouted at her to change. They slapped her and shaken her as she told them over and over again with rising hysteria that she had no idea what they were talking about, no idea what they were asking her to do. She hadn't cried enough, even though she'd wanted to. Tessa hated to cry, especially in front of people she didn't trust. And of the only two in the world she trusted, one was dead and the other imprisoned. They had told her that. The Dark Sisters had told her that they had Nate, and that if she didn't do what they said, he would die. They showed her his ring, the one that had been her father's, stained with blood now to prove it. They hadn't let her hold it or touch it, had snatched it back as long as she'd reached for it, but she recognized it. It was Nate's.